So I think it's good we start with Surah Al-Fatiha. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Maliki yawmiddin. Iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'een. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين صدق الله العلي العظيم. أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين ولعن الله على أعدائهم أجمعين من الأولين والآخرين آمين يا رب العالمين. أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. So this is part 31 of our ongoing series of discussions on the book attributed to Imam al-Sadiq entitled Misbah al-Sharia, or the Lantern of the Path. As is the case for each of these sessions in this series and other series, there is a requirement for anyone consuming this to at the very least take a cursory look at the previous sessions, though I would strongly say that studying them properly is far more beneficial. This is because of the nature of the subject matter truly does require a building up of understanding in a step-by-step manner. Each session, therefore, builds upon the one before, and it's crucial that previous sessions are studied, even if in a cursory manner, so that we can try to ensure that misunderstandings and confusion do not ensue, and as well as ensure that we can garner more understanding from each session. Nevertheless, if I can get a salawat, we do have a recap.
اللهم صل
اللهم
على
صل على محمد
محمد وآل محمد
محمد.
عجل فرجه.
So before we begin our journey into the life of the sixth Imam, it has been some time since we last met, and a period during which the echoes of ash-Sharia and the lessons of Arba'een have settled in our hearts. It is only therefore fitting that we pause and retrace the path that we've walked together in this series, the Lantern of the Path, for our journey. For our journey is a single unbroken chain of understanding. We began not with abstract doctrines, but with the very essence of our existence, ubudiyyah, or servitude, true servitude to God. We learned that to be a true servant is to first understand the rights of the one we serve. This led us to the bedrock of our ideology, not as a list of disconnected beliefs, but as a more holistic journey toward him. Our goal we established is Tawheed, to be entirely absorbed in the uniqueness of our beloved. The destination that proves our worthiness for that goal is Ma'ad, the Day of Judgment. The path between this beginning and that end is illuminated by the constant unwavering principle of Adl Ilahi or Adala, which is the justice of God. Under the expansive canopy of his justice, we explored its manifestations, Nubuwah or prophethood, the divine call to resurrect society from ignorance, Wilayah guardianship, and Imamah leadership, the guardianship and leadership that protects and clarifies this call through the ages. We did not study these as mere history. Instead, we bore witness to them as a living, breathing reality, a continuous struggle against the forces of Taghut, which is rebellion and disbelief and oppression. We followed this sacred light from the mission of the seal of the prophets, Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, through the steadfastness of the commander of the faithful, Imam Ali, peace and blessings be upon him. We examine the oft misunderstood pillar in the structure of divine guidance, Sayyidah Fatimah al-Zahra, peace and blessings upon her. We saw the profound wisdom in the strategic patience of Imam Hassan, and we felt the earth-shattering sacrifice of the master of the martyrs, Imam Hussein, peace and blessings be upon him and Imam Hassan. We then walked in the footsteps of the messengers of Karbala, Sayyid Zainab and the resilient Imam Sajjad, whose whispered revolution of supplication kept the flame of truth alive in the darkest of nights. And this brought us to our last session, where we turned the page from the tears of Imam Sajjad to the dawn of a new era. We did not simply learn about the fifth Imam. We encountered the architect of a grand renewal, Imam Muhammad ibn Ali al-Baqir, the splitter of knowledge. We witnessed how his Imamah served as the pivotal bridge between the quiet endurance of his father and the great intellectual ocean that would be unleashed by his son. In an era where the tyrants of the Umayyad dynasty had grown momentarily complacent, Imam al-Baqir seized the lull, not with the sword, but with sacred knowledge. He transformed the Prophet's mosque into a fortress of correct creed, refuting the distortions of palace scholars and reviving the revolutionary principle that every matter must be measured against the Book of God and the Sunnah of his messenger. He laid the foundations, organized the network of true believers, and prepared the soil for the seeds of a profound intellectual awakening. He was the one who split open the earth of a dormant ummah to reveal the pure springs of prophetic wisdom that lay beneath. And in doing so, he paved the way for the one who would inherit his mission and turn these springs into a flowing, unending river, his son, and our guide for the session to come, Imam Jafar al-Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him and his father. And so, with our memories refreshed and our purpose renewed, we turn our gaze from the splitter of knowledge to the ocean of wisdom. In his most beautiful name and filled with awe at his profound love for his creation, we continue. Please give me a salawat and we move forward.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
So, when the soul of Imam Muhammad al-Baqir, peace and blessings be upon him, ascended to its Lord, the landscape of the Islamic world was in flux. The whispered revolution of Imam Zayn al-Abidin, peace be upon him, carried in his supplications and gatherings, secret gatherings, had been nurtured by the careful, methodical wisdom of Imam al-Baqir. The seeds were ready to break through the soil. The Umayyad dynasty, rotting from within, was consumed by internal power struggles. Its weakness was a gaping wound, and the stench of its corruption filled the air. Into this volatile world, Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him, inherited the mantle of Imamah, not merely as a teacher, but as the commander of a revolution waiting to be unleashed. This was the fulfillment of God's promise to the oppressed, a promise that resounds through the Quran. In Surah Qasas, the chapter of the narrations, 28th chapter of the Quran, verse number 5, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "And we desire to show favor to those who are abased in the land, and to make them leaders or imams, and to make them inheritors." The secret plan was monumental, to awaken the vast hidden network of believers, the Shia, spread from Khurasan to Ray to Iraq and Hijaz, and from Egypt to Morocco. The aim was to march upon Damascus, to overthrow the rule of Banu Umayyah, and to re-establish the prophetic government in Medina in its purest form. Imam Baqir, in his final days, looked upon his son and declared him the Qa'im of Ali Muhammad for that time. The title Qa'im is not restricted solely to the awaited Imam al-Mahdi, may our souls be his ransom, may God hasten his return. Rather, it belongs to every Imam who rises against oppression to uphold God's justice. Imam al-Baqir has said, and this is from Kamal ad-Din, but all of the references and citations on the write-up, I invite everyone to review the write-up. So Imam Baqir has said, all of us Imams are the Qa'im who rise with the command of God, one after another, until the master of the affair, yani Sahib al-Amr, the master of the age, comes. This is Imam Mahdi. Therefore, Imam al-Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him, was meant to be the Qa'im of his era, the inheritor of a mission poised to move from concealment into open confrontation. Now, to understand Imam al-Sadiq, we must see him through three interwoven dimensions. The first one is the expression of the Imamah, which is al-Jihad. Imam al-Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him, was first and foremost a man of Jihad, a struggler in the path of God. His battlefield was creed and clarification, where he openly proclaimed his right to leadership. He embodied the Quranic command, which is, this is from Surah Al-Anfal, the chapter of the spoils of war, verse number 8, chapter number 8, verse 39, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "And fight them until there is no more fitna or sedition or corruption, and the religion is entirely for God." On the plains of Arafah, amidst a vast Hajj crowd, Imam al-Sadiq declared, he said, and this is from Al-Kafi, but all of the references are in the write-up, and I encourage everyone to review that. Imam al-Sadiq said, "O people, the messenger of God was the Imam, then it was Ali ibn Abi Talib, then Hassan, then Hussein, then Ali ibn al-Hussein, then Muhammad ibn Ali, and then I am. This was a direct refutation of both Umayyad and Abbasid claims, a public act of Tabyeen or clarification that required immense courage. Second dimension is teaching and explanation, al-ilm. Imam al-Sadiq's school in Medina was unmatched in Islamic history. He laid down the pure foundations of Jafari jurisprudence, explained the Quran with the insight of al-Bayt, and trained thousands of students. Here he fulfilled the Prophet's hadith of the two weighty things, al-Thaqalain. And this is a well-known hadith. It reads, I am leaving among you two weighty things. Rasulullah, Prophet Muhammad had said, I'm leaving among you two weighty things, the book of God and my progeny, my al-Bayt. If you hold fast to them both, you will never go astray after me. And this is well cited in the books of the Shia and the Sunnah. The third dimension is hidden organization, or what we call al-Tanzim. Behind the public face of scholarship and proclamation, Imam al-Sadiq constructed a vast disciplined organization. His representatives, or wukala, operated across the Islamic world, collecting funds, guiding followers, and preparing the faithful for resistance. Imam Khomeini, may God rest his pure soul, described, he said, the Imams, peace be upon them, operated in a political, organized manner. Imam al-Sadiq, peace be upon him, was the head of this organization to prepare the ground for the establishment of a just government. And this is from Imam Khomeini's lectures on Wilayah al-Faqih and Hukumat al-Islami. Again, the references and citations are in the write-up. Now, let us now move on to the great betrayal, which is, let's navigate the Abbasi deception. But before we do, can I have a salawat, please?
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
So, Abbasids rose under the banner of Ahl-Bayt, but their reality was treachery. The Quran warns of such hypocrites. In Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, the chapter of the cow, second chapter of the Quran, verse number 14, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, when they meet those who believe, they say, we believe. But when they are alone with their devils, they say, indeed, we are with you. We were only mocking. This verse speaks directly to the opportunism of the Abbasids, who claimed loyalty to the household of the Prophet outwardly, but privately pursued their own lust for power. The danger of such betrayal is not confined to the Abbasids. It is a timeless warning. As Ayatollah Sayyid Muhammad Fadlallah, may God rest his pure soul, cautioned, he who does not stand within the bounds of truth will one day find himself humiliated under the weight of history. Similarly, Imam Khamenei, may Allah protect him, emphasized the constant danger of derailment. He said, the role of the Wali Faqih is to ensure that in this complex and intertwined system, the course of the system does not deviate from its goals and values. It must not veer to the left or to the right. And again, the references for all of these are in the write-up. These insights capture the reality of Imam Sadiq's time. The Abbasids hijacked a revolution intended to restore the rule of Ahl-Bayt, diverting it to tyranny cloaked with false slogans. The people, intoxicated by appearances, were deceived into believing the Abbasids and believing that the Abbasids embodied the cause of the Prophet's family. Let us now look at the unbending Imam and Imam's defiance against Mansur. Mansur al-Dawaniqi, the Abbasid tyrant, knew Imam Sadiq's influence was unmatched. He threatened, may God, and this is Mansur saying, may God kill me if I do not kill you. And he's referencing Imam Sadiq. He even ordered, burn down the house of Ja'far ibn Muhammad. When fire engulfed Imam Sadiq's home, the Imam emerged through the flames, declaring, I am the son of the veins of the earth. I am the son of Ibrahim, the friend of God. And he was echoing the Quranic miracle where in Quran, in Surah Anbiya, the chapter of the prophets, 21st chapter of the Quran, verse 69, Allah tells the fire, he says, we said, O fire, be cool and safe for Ibrahim. Said Hassan Nasrallah, echoing the Imam's spirit, has reminded the Ummah in his Ashura sermons, where he says, وَحِحَاتْ مِنَّ الظِّلَّةِ, and how far from us is humiliation. These words trace back to Imam Hussein on Ashura, where he says, beware, the illegitimate son of an illegitimate father has left me between two choices, between the sword and humiliation. And how far from us is humiliation? God, his messenger, the believers, the pure wombs, and noble souls all refuse that we should prefer obedience to the vile over the deaths of the honorable. And this is, of course, from Al-Luhuf of Sayyid ibn Tawus. And this is a famous sermon of Imam Hussein. Imam Sadiq's confrontation with Mansur was therefore not submission, but rather it was the continuation of Imam Hussein's defiance. It ended with his martyrdom by poison in 148 years after Hijrah, a final testament to his unbending stand for truth. The Imam's martyrdom was the final inevitable chapter in a life of unbending defiance. But to truly understand why this confrontation was destined from the start, we must look back to the very foundation of his struggle, his fearless and public invitation to the true Imamah, a call that struck at the heart of the Caliphate's legitimacy. Please give me a salawat and we move on to the main section, which is first starting with the invitation to Imamah, clarification as confrontation.
اللهم صل على محمد محمد.
So first, let us look at the Quranic foundation of authority and the rejection of tyranny. The declaration of Imam al-Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him, was not merely a theological claim, nor was it just an abstract spiritual statement. It was a direct confrontation with the ruling order of his time. It was rooted in the Quranic mandate that true authority belongs to Allah, to his messenger, and the divinely appointed successors. In the Quran, in Surah An-Nisa, the chapter of the women, 4th chapter of the Quran, verse number 59, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, O you who have faith, obey God and obey the apostle and those vested with authority amongst you. This verse not only establishes the ulil amr, those vested in authority, as a divine category, but it also exposes the illegitimacy of rulers who seize power through force. To follow such tyrants is to fall under the deception described again by Quran. This is from Surah Ibrahim, the chapter of Prophet Abraham, 14th chapter of the Quran, verse number 22, where Allah says, and when the matter has been decided, Satan will say, indeed, God made you a promise, a true promise, and I too made you a promise, but I failed you. Yet I had no authority over you except that I called you and you responded to me. By openly naming himself as the rightful Imam, Imam al-Sadiq was unveiling the satanic illusion of Umayyad and Abbasi power. Let's now look at the public call at Arafat. Among the preserved narrations is the testimony of Amr ibn Abil Miqdam, who recounts the Imam's act of public clarification during Hajj. This is from Bihar al-Anwar, and I will read you the hadith. It says, and Amr is narrating this. He says, I performed Hajj with Abu Abdullah. This is Imam Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him. When we reached Arafah, he looked at the people and said, O people, indeed the messenger of God, peace and blessings be upon him and his family, was the Imam. Then came Ali ibn Abi Talib, then Hassan, then Hussein, then Ali ibn al-Hussein, then Muhammad ibn Ali, and now I am here. Then he, Imam Sadiq, struck his chest 3 times and said, by God, I am the Imam, and my household after me are Imams. The choice of Arafat was profoundly strategic. Just as the Prophet had delivered his farewell sermon on this plain before the gathering of Muslims from across the world, so too did Imam Sadiq, seizing the stage of pilgrimage to clarify truth. In an age without mass media, Arafah was the global pulpit. Let's now look at the Imam as custodian of Anfal and Safw al-Mal. And we'll come to what these definitions are shortly. Imam al-Sadiq taught that the Imamah was not an abstract spiritual office, but it was a lived authority, encompassing the moral, political, and economic leadership of the entire Ummah. In one narration, Abu Sabah al-Kinani reports, he says, Abu Abdullah, that's Imam al-Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him, said, "Indeed, the anfal and the choicest of wealth, which is safwa al-mal, belong to us." So now comes the question, what are anfal and safwa al-mal? These are terms maybe many people haven't heard. So let's look at anfal first of all. Anfal. These are resources and properties not privately owned, but belonging to God and His Messenger. Things such as unclaimed lands, mines, forests, deserts, and seas. In Shia jurisprudence, anfal are placed under the custodianship of the Imam, who manages them for the welfare of the community. In Islamic law, the term anfal refers to public resources, such as unclaimed lands, mines, forests, and seas, which are not private property, but belong to God and His Messenger. They are placed under the custodianship of the Imam to be managed for the welfare of the Ummah. Let's now look at safwa al-mal. Literally, safwa al-mal means the choicest of wealth. In the context of spoils or communal wealth, this refers to the best items, such as the finest horses, the best armor, or treasures. These are reserved for the Prophet or the Imam by divine right. When the Imam says, Al-anfal wa safwa al-mal lana, the spoils and the choicest share of wealth is for us, he is declaring that the communal resources of the Ummah, its mines, forests, lands, and the choicest share of its wealth, belong by divine right to the al-Bayt, and not to the dynasties who usurp them. Together, they signify that the Imam is the legitimate custodian of both natural resources and the most valuable portions of wealth, preventing tyrants from monopolizing them. This leads us to the Quranic foundation of khums. And this teaching is rooted in the Quran, which establishes the principle of khums, or 1/5. In Quran, in Surah Anfal, the chapter of the spoils of war, 8th chapter of the Quran, verse 41, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Know that whatever you may take as spoils of war, 1/5 of it indeed belongs to God, the apostle, the apostle's relatives, the orphans, the needy, and the traveler." While some Sunni jurists limit this to war booty, the Ahl-Bayt explained that this idea of ghanimtum over here, this word ghanimtum over here, means any form of profit or gain, making khums applicable not only to the spoils of war, but also to profits from trade, agriculture, mines, and treasures. In the broader sense, safwa al-mal overlaps with the Imam's portion of khums, the best and most valuable part of wealth set aside by divine right. Anfal further extends this sovereignty to natural and communal resources, ensuring they are not usurped by unjust rulers. Therefore, and this is very important, therefore, Imam al-Sadiq's declaration was not about personal enrichment. It was a political and theological assertion that the rightful economic leadership of the Ummah rests only with Ahlul Bayt. Let's now have a look at the jurisprudence of the Honorable Maraja. And the rulings of the contemporary Maraja actually make this continuity clear. First of all, Ayatollah al-Udma Sistani. His ruling on khums is like this. Khums is obligatory on everything a person gains from profits of business, crafts, farming, and similar sources, after deducting the yearly expenses for himself and his dependents. Half of this khums is the share of the Imam, which is also known as Sahma Imam, which during occultation is entrusted to the Marja for supporting religious, educational, and social causes. Let's now look at Sayyid al-Qaid, Imam Khamenei. Imam Khamenei explains that anfal today, such as oil, gas, forests, and mines, are managed by the Islamic government as the deputy of the Imam al-Mahdi, Ajalla Ta'ala Faraj al-Sharif, may our souls be his ransom. He says, the anfal and public wealth, such as mines, forests, and seas, belong to the Islamic government and are under the authority of the Wali al-Faqih to be used for the interests of the Muslims. So what are the theological and political implications of this? When Imam al-Sadiq declared al-Anfal wa safwa al-mal lana, the spoils and the choicest share of wealth is for us, he was exposing the hypocrisy of rulers who plundered public wealth in the name of Islam. He reminded the Ummah that true sovereignty lies with the divinely appointed Imams, not with dynasties who hoard resources. By reclaiming Anfal and Safwa al-Mal for Ahl al-Bayt, the Imam was laying down a principle of economic justice and divine authority, one that still governs the Shia community today through the institution of Khums and the custodianship of public resources. Please give me a salawat and we move on to the network and the shield, Taqiyyah as a revolutionary method.
اللهم صل على
اللهم صل على
محمد
محمد
وآل محمد.
محمد.
So Imam al-Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him, was deeply aware of the dangers of confronting tyrannical rulers unprepared. His struggle was not reckless opposition, but it was a calculated strategy, proclaiming the truth when possible, and when the Ummah was vulnerable, he trained his followers in Taqiyyah, or strategic prudence. He described it in clear and stark terms, preserving the survival of his movement and laying the groundwork for future resistance. In his words, Taqiyyah is the shield of the believer, and Taqiyyah is the safeguard of the believer. There is no faith for the one who has no Taqiyyah. This was no minor counsel. Imam al-Sadiq institutionalized Taqiyyah as a revolutionary method. It was both a network and a shield, a way to preserve the lives and unity of the Shia under persecution, while keeping alive the flame of Wilayah that would otherwise have been extinguished. Imam al-Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him, and the early Shia teachers often explained Taqiyyah not only as a shield, but also as a weapon. Just as the spear belongs to the battlefield, Taqiyyah belongs to the struggle against tyranny. It is the believer's spear, shield, and fortress. In Imam Khamenei's words, he says, "Where is the spear used? The spear is used on the battlefield. So too is Taqiyyah. It is the shield, the rampart, the saver, and the spear of the believer. In those times when we practiced Taqiyyah, it meant that when we brought down the weight of the sword upon the wretched body of the enemy, he could see neither the sword nor the hand that held it, nor its raising or descent, but he only felt the pain and the cut." This analogy reveals the deeper reality. Taqiyyah is not cowardice, but strategy. It conceals the hand until the decisive blow can be struck, disorienting the enemy who cannot perceive where the strike comes from. It ensures survival without surrender, patience without paralysis, and prepares the ground for eventual victory. So now let's look at the Quranic foundations of Taqiyyah. The Imam's teaching rested on the Quran itself. Two verses in particular became the foundation. Firstly, we have the story of Ammar ibn Yasir. In Quran, in Surah An-Nahl, the chapter of the bee, 16th chapter of the Quran, verse number 106. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Whoever renounces faith in God after having believed, except someone who is compelled while his heart remains serene in faith." This was revealed about Ammar ibn Yasir, who was tortured until he uttered the words of disbelief. Though his tongue faltered, his heart remained steadfast. And Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and his family comforted him, affirming that coerced words do not annul sincere faith. At-Tabarsi, who is a Shia mufassir, a Shia exegist, explains in his book Majma al-Bayan, again, the references are all in the write-up. At-Tabarsi says, At-Tabrisi, says, this verse absolves the one who spoke with his tongue against his will, while his heart did not consent. Fakhruddin Razi, who is a Sunni commentator, says, this is what is called Taqiyyah, when the compelled one outwardly displays disbelief by his tongue, while inwardly holding to faith. Therefore, the ordeal of Ammar became the paradigm of Taqiyyah, faith sheltered within the heart, while the tongue bends to survive. Let's now look at the principle of prudence. In Quran, in Surah Al-Imran, the chapter of the family of Imran, third chapter of the Quran, verse number 28, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, the believers must not take the disbelievers as allies, except when you protect yourselves from them out of prudence. Allama Tabatabai defines this. And this is from Al-Mizan. He says, Taqiyyah is the outward display of what contradicts the inner reality of out of necessity, fear or harm, while the heart remains firm in belief. Ayatollah Makarim Shirazi, he says, Taqiyyah is neither hypocrisy nor is it falsehood, but it is a rational means to preserve faith and lives in the face of tyranny. Therefore, the Quran shows us two dimensions, one rooted in Ammar's suffering and the other universalized into principle. Both converge in Imam al-Sadiq's movement. But before we carry on, we must answer some misconceptions. So give me a loud salawat and we will do that, inshallah.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
So before we get into the biblical parallels, there's a quick guide to some terms that we will be using. So first of all, there is a term called midrash. What is the midrash? The midrash is the classical Jewish corpus of rabbinic interpretations on scripture, roughly from the 2nd to the 10th century of the Common Era. They blend tafsir, exegesis, parable stories, and homily to draw ethical and theological lessons from the Hebrew Bible. Midrash often expands verses with narrative detail to instruct communities under pressure, so meanings can be transmitted and protected even in hostile contexts. The next term is targumim. What are the targumim? Targumim are Aramaic translations, often paraphrased, of the Hebrew Bible, produced for synagogue reading in late antiquity. This is when Aramaic was the main language, the vernacular. A targum usually renders the verse and embeds interpretation within the translation itself. So it has the verse, but it also mixes the translation, the interpretation, into it, functioning as both scripture in vernacular and a discrete layer of commentary. It's useful when authorities might be listening. So let's now look at the biblical parallels, and maybe this will become a little bit clearer. Critics, both hostile polemicists and some apologetic Muslims, have tried to paint Taqiyyah as a license to deceive or lie. This is a distortion. Islam condemns deceit. Taqiyyah is prudence under duress. To make the contrast clear, consider how some biblical and post-biblical streams valorized ambush or cunning as a mode of warfare. First of all, we look at the biblical traditions on cunning in warfare. In the Old Testament, Genesis 49:17, you have, Dan shall be a serpent in the way, a viper by the path, that bites the horse's heels so that its rider falls backwards. And in the Hebrew Midrash on Genesis, it is interpreted as, Dan shall judge his people. Our rabbis said, this refers to Samson. Dan shall be a serpent in the way. Why? Just as the serpent bites and kills more than all beasts, so Samson bit and killed more than them all. And the references for all of these are also in the write-up. Here the serpent becomes the emblem of the hidden sudden strike, the seed of a deception or ambush leading to war reading. In the Targum on Genesis 49:17, it says, Dan shall be like a serpent in the way, a viper on the path, biting the horse's heels so that its rider falls backwards. Note that the Targum stresses on this word, borha, which means on the road. Like Dan shall be like a serpent on the road, on the way, lurking in the path, amplifying this ambush motif. And of course, in the Old Testament, in Proverbs 24:6, you have, by strategies you shall wage war. Now, while many classic Jewish commentators read this word of takhbulut as wise counsel or plans, which is why we say strategies, later political readings sharpen this into the modern slogan, by way of deception you shall wage war. In our time, that phrase circulates in military and intelligence discourse, elevating deceit to a doctrine of power. Let's now look at Taqiyyah as strategic concealment. Islam's stance is the opposite. Deceit is categorically condemned even in war. Imam Khamenei has explained. Where is the spear used? The spear is used on the battlefield. So too is Taqiyyah. It is the shield, the rampart, the saver, and the spear of the believer. In those times when we practiced Taqiyyah, it meant that when we brought down the weight of the sword upon the wretched body of the enemy, he could see neither the sword nor the hand that held it, nor its raising or descent, but he only felt the pain and the cut. This analogy reveals the deeper reality. Taqiyyah is not cowardice, rather it is strategy. It is the shield that absorbs the blow and the hidden spear that unsettles the enemy, concealing the hand until the decisive strike can be delivered. The enemy sees neither the sword nor the hand that wields it, only the wound when it comes. Yet, this concealment is not deceit, for the believer does not fabricate falsehood. He withholds his truth until its revelation will be effective. It ensures survival without surrender, patience without paralysis, and prepares the ground for eventual victory. Let's now look at the uncompromising prohibition of deceit within Islam. And here lies the critical distinction. In the biblical and later Jewish interpretive traditions, the Hebrew word takhbulot in Proverbs 24:6 was understood by many classical rabbis as wise counsel or strategic plans, as I had said. But in later political and military contexts, it was sharpened into the infamous phrase, by way of deception you shall wage war. That slogan elevated deception into a doctrine of power. Islam, as we've said, by contrast, draws a very clear line. Deception, khida or ghish, is categorically condemned even in war. The Quran declares, this is from Surah Yusuf, the chapter of Prophet Joseph, 12th chapter of the Quran, verse number 52. Indeed, God does not guide the scheming of the treacherous. And the messenger of God, peace and blessings be upon him and his family, said, whoever deceives us is not of us. Therefore, Taqiyyah is not deceit, nor is it lying for advantage. It is temporary concealment under credible threat, while the heart remains anchored in truth. When abandoning concealment would itself expose tyranny and honor Islam, as was the case with Imam Hussein in Karbala, then Taqiyyah is not permitted. Speech and sacrifice become the duty. Therefore, the caricature collapses. Taqiyyah is not hypocrisy. It is faith's shield, not its betrayal. Part of the Imam's revolutionary method to protect lives, to preserve truth, and sustain the community until open resistance became righteous and effective. With the shield of Taqiyyah firmly in place, safeguarding the community from the tyrant's sword, Imam al-Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him, would now unsheath his own weapon, a weapon not of steel, but of sacred knowledge. It was with this weapon that he began the calm but persistent jihad of clarifying the divine rules of Islam. Please give me a loud salawat and we move on to preaching and expressing the religious rules according to Shia jurisprudence.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجه.
So Imam al-Sadiq's distinctive role in preaching and jurisprudence. Among the Imams of al-Bayt, the legacy of Imam Jafar al-Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him, is uniquely characterized by the vast scope of his scientific and jurisprudential activity. While every Imam safeguarded the religion and clarified divine truth, the historical circumstances of Imam al-Sadiq's era, a time of transition between the decline of the Umayyads and the rise of the Abbasids, as we've said, created a window in which his scholarly authority could shine with greater breadth and depth. It is no coincidence, therefore, that the Shia school of law came to be named after him, al-Madhhab al-Ja'fariyya. Even non-Shia historians and researchers who attempt to downplay the Imam's political mission nevertheless acknowledge that no other contemporary authority matched his breadth of teaching in jurisprudence, hadith, theology, and Quranic exegesis. Yet, as Sayyid Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr observed, this very concentration on the Imam's jurisprudential legacy often obscures its political dimension. To teach and to clarify divine law in opposition to the state-sponsored jurists was itself a form of struggle or jihad, an act of resistance to the distortion of Islam at the hands of power. Imam Khamenei explains this in a wider framework. He says, Ja'fari fiqh is not merely a science for individual and devotional matters. It is a way of social life, a school of resistance against tyranny, and the preservation of Islamic identity. This point reveals why jurisprudence or fiqh cannot be detached from politics. In Islam, rulership is never merely administrative. The Quran defines leadership as both governance and moral spiritual authority. In Quran, Surah Baqarah, chapter of the cow, second chapter of the Quran, verse 124, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, when his Lord tested Abraham with certain words and he fulfilled them, he said, I am making you the Imam of mankind. Abraham then said, and from among my descendants, and Allah, God replied, my covenant does not reach the wrongdoers. Therefore, an Imam or a Khalif in the Quranic conception is not a mere political chief. He must embody knowledge, justice, and divine guidance. The corruption of this principle is precisely what Imam al-Sadiq stood against. Ayatollah Sayyid Mohsen Fadlallah, may God rest his pure soul, summarizes this reality. Imamate in Islam is not worldly authority, but a spiritual, intellectual, and political leadership all at once. It is inconceivable that it should be held by the ignorant or the unjust. So let's now look at the Caliphate and the problem of religious authority. The institution of the Caliphate in Islam was never designed to be a mere apparatus of governance. From its very inception, the Caliph was presented as the successor of the Prophet, entrusted not only with political power, but also with religious leadership, moral guidance, and the safeguarding of revelation. The title Khalifat Rasulullah, meaning the successor of the Messenger of God, itself indicates that this role was intended to encompass both authority in governance and authority in religion. But herein lay the central problem. When the seat of Caliphate fell into the hands of rulers who lacked religious knowledge, and worse, who were often indifferent or hostile to its spirit, they sought to cover this deficiency by recruiting religious figures who were compliant with state policy. The result was the birth of a class of court scholars, fuqaha sultan, who blurred the lines between the divine truth and political expediency. The Quran had already forewarned against this corruption of leadership. In Surah Nisa, the chapter of the women, fourth chapter of the Quran, verse 59, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, O you who have faith, obey God and obey the apostle and those vested with authority amongst you. And if you dispute concerning anything, refer it to God and the Apostle. Let's now look at co-opted scholars and distorted jurisprudence. When the Caliphate fell into the hands of rulers indifferent or hostile to authentic Islam, their lack of knowledge created a very serious problem: how to maintain the facade of religious authority while pursuing policies of tyranny and self-interest. Their solution was to co-opt religious scholars, willing to bend divine law to political convenience. From the late Umayyads to the early Abbasid period, this process developed in two ways. First of all, you have forged traditions, or hadith al-mawdu'ah. Early historians record how fabricated narrations were produced in praise of the rulers or in justification of their actions. Ibn Abil Hadid, in his Sharh Nahj al-Balagha, and Ibn Abil Hadid is a Sunni, is a Mu'tazili commentator of Nahj al-Balagha. He describes how paid transmitters flooded the community with false reports that normalized corruption or vilified al-Bayt. He quotes from Abu Ja'far al-Iskafi saying, Muawiyah employed a group of the companions and a group of the successors to fabricate disgraceful reports about Ali, peace be upon him, that would disparage him and declare disavowal from him. For this they were given payments that people would find enticing. Among those were Abu Hurairah, Amr ibn al-As, Mughira ibn Shu'bah. They invented what pleased him, yani what pleased Muawiyah, and it spread on the tongues of the successors after them, and narration of it multiplied until it reached their children and households, who then related it further. It multiplied and dispersed in all regions, and remained in the hands of the common people, who circulated it and taught it in their schools as they taught the Quran, until the young grew up on it and the old grew old upon it, knowing no other teaching. Let's now look at the second method, which is corrupt methods of fiqh. Tools such as qiyas, or analogy, and istihsan, which is subjective preference, allowed jurists, in inverted commas, to create rulings aligned with rulers' desires, rather than divine revelation. By declaring something haram or halal according to their own opinion, they effectively rewrote the law of God. Imam al-Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him, confronted this head-on. In Kafi, he is reported to have said, indeed, the first who used qiyas or analogy was Iblis. Whoever applies qiyas or analogy to any aspect of religion by his own opinion, God will pair him with Iblis. This rejection of qiyas or analogy was not mere scholastic disagreement. It was a rejection of the entire political project of the Caliphate, which depended on pliant jurists to sanctify its injustice. The Quran itself condemns the blending of personal desire with divine law. In Surah Al-Jathiyah, the chapter of the kneeling, 45th chapter of the Quran, verse number 23, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, have you seen him who takes his desire to be his God, and God leads him astray knowingly? Ayatollah Jawadi Amali, may Allah protect him, comments that this verse precisely describes the jurist who issues a fatwa based on the whims of rulers rather than the evidence of Quran and Sunnah. He says in Tafsir Tasneem, the mufti who makes desires the foundation of his fatwa is in reality worshipping his desire, not God. And again, the references and everything are in the write-up. This manipulation was not limited to jurisprudence, but extended to Quranic interpretation. Exegesis tafsir was bent to support dynastic policies. In this sense, the state-sponsored jurist became an instrument of propaganda, veiling tyranny with the garb of religion. By contrast, the school of Ahl-Bayt was uncompromising. No ruling could be issued without firm proof, dalil qat'i, from Quran or the authentic Sunnah. No personal preference, istihsan, or political calculation, maslaha, could override divine revelation. The Imams insisted that divine law is not subject to the whims of rulers, but is eternal, rooted in justice. Imam Khomeini put it very succinctly. He said, Shia jurisprudence is the jurisprudence of resistance, and it has stood firm against analogy or qiyas and juristic preference, istihsan, because it does not trade truth for politics. Therefore, what appeared to many as a technical dispute over legal methodology was in truth a front line of political resistance. To deny qiyas or analogy was to deny the state's claim to legitimacy. To insist on revelation over opinion was to expose the Caliphate as unfit for divine leadership. Classical Shia exegesis, including al-Tabrisi in Majlis al-Bayan and al-Allama Tabatabai in al-Mizan, makes clear that those vested with authority, ulil amr, must be those divinely appointed with knowledge and infallibility. So first of all, from Majlis al-Bayan fi Tafsir al-Quran of al-Tabrisi, he says, it is narrated from our Imams, peace and blessings be upon them, that those vested with authority are the Imams from the family of Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him and his family. This was related from al-Baqir and al-Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon them. And it is the narration from Abu Ja'far, that's Imam al-Baqir, and Abu Abdullah, Imam al-Sadiq, peace be upon them. This is the correct view according to us, because God the Most High has made obedience to them unconditional, just as he made obedience to his messenger unconditional. And one who is not infallible cannot be obeyed unconditionally, for he cannot be secure from error. And in Al-Mizan, Allama Tabatabai says, it is not valid to take those vested with authority to mean anyone other than the infallible, because God has made obedience to them on the same level as obedience to himself and to his messenger, peace be upon him and his family. This cannot apply except to one whose protection from error and sin is established. Therefore, it is confirmed that those vested with authority are the infallible Imams from the household of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him and his family. Otherwise, the verse would amount to sanctioning obedience to tyrants, which would contradict the Quranic insistence that, again, this is Surah Al-Baqarah, it's the verse about Prophet Ibrahim that I mentioned earlier, the last portion. It says in Surah Al-Baqarah, chapter of the cow, second chapter of the Quran, verse number 124, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, my covenant does not reach the wrongdoers. Imam Ali, peace and blessings be upon him, had warned of this danger in Nahj Balagha. He said, O people must have a leader, whether righteous or wicked. Under his leadership, the believer works, and under him, the unbeliever also enjoys his share. Through him, God brings everything to its end. With him, taxes are collected, enemies fought, roads protected, and the weak take their rights from the strong, until the righteous finds rest and the wicked is relieved of being contained. This pattern repeated under both the Umayyads and the Abbasid rulers who knew little of religion and leaned on the manufactured religious class to give their policies a veneer of divine legitimacy. And of course, we know this happens in most communities, even in our time. Therefore, thus began the cycle of political manipulation of fiqh and hadith. Distortion dressed up as jurisprudence. Ayatollah Sistani, may Allah protect him, in his guidance on leadership and responsibility, frames the problem succinctly. He says, the supreme religious authority affirms that in Islam, a ruler must be committed to justice and knowledge of the rulings of religion, and that one who does not possess these conditions has no legitimacy in governance. The abuse of authority, therefore, is not a mere historical footnote. It represents a central crisis of the Muslim community after the Prophet, a crisis where power claimed the name of religion, but lacked its substance. Imam al-Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him, rose precisely at this intersection, unveiling the gap between the true divine guidance and the counterfeit authority of the ruling dynasties. Let's now look at the two currents of jurisprudence. From the earliest Islamic centuries, jurisprudence split into two distinct currents. First of all, you have governmental jurisprudence. This current was shaped by the needs of ruling dynasties. Its jurists were often attached to the court, issuing rulings that sanctified the policies of the rulers. Their fatwas or edicts frequently bent divine law to justify oppression, justify taxation abuses, or even the shedding of innocent blood. As Ibn Abil Hadid narrates in his commentary on Nahj Balagha, he says, "You must know that the age at that time was dark, and that those who transmitted traditions and reports had leaned towards the people of this world. The hand of politics held power over everything, so it is no wonder that in those times fabricated reports were produced or accounts were altered in their meaning." And this is actually his part of his commentary on Khutbah Taqiyyah of Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali. So by relying on methods such as, like we've said, qiyas, analogy, and istihsan, subjective preference, these jurists left the door wide open for distortion. What rulers deemed beneficial, maslaha, could be dressed in the cloak of Sharia. The Quran, however, warned against precisely this form of betrayal. In Quran, Surah Baqarah, the chapter of the cow, second chapter of the Quran, verse 42, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Do not mix the truth with falsehood, nor conceal the truth while you know." This current, though official, was in reality illegal in the eyes of God, because it sold divine truth for worldly gain, and it remains illegal to this day. The second current is the school of al-Bayt, or Jafari jurisprudence. This current, which was opposite to the one we just spoke about, was upheld by the Imams of the Prophet's household. It was noble, honest, and uncompromising, refusing to sacrifice truth at the altar of politics. Instead of personal preference, it was anchored in Quran and authentic hadith. Instead of pandering to rulers, it confronted their deviations. Imam al-Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him, spread a vast network of students, teaching them to issue rulings based only on evidence or dala'il, not on opinion. Al-Kulayni and Al-Kafi narrates, Abu Abdullah, that's Imam al-Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him, said, "It is only upon us to present to you the principles. Upon you it is to derive the branches." Here the Imam lays down the methodology of Shia fiqh. The Imams are the authoritative sources of divine law, and their followers derive rulings faithfully from these roots, not from whims or political diktats. Said Hassan Nasrallah, may God bless his pure soul, reflected on this when analyzing the resistance identity of Shiism. He said, "The jurisprudence of Ahl al-Bayt, peace and blessings be upon them, is the jurisprudence of resistance. It rejects oppression, it rejects falsehood, and it stands before the tyrannical ruler with the truth. This is what Imam Khomeini embodied, and after him, Imam Khamenei." Therefore, the Ja'fari school was not just a legal system. It was a political statement. By refusing to validate the rulings of government jurists, Imam al-Sadiq delegitimized the very claim of the caliphs to be guardians of the religion. As Imam Khomeini, may God rest his pure soul, later explained, in Ja'fari fiqh, separation of religion from politics has never been proposed. All of fiqh is politics. Politics that seeks to form the human being from cradle to grave, from this world to the hereafter. Whoever imagines that religion is separate from politics has understood neither religion nor politics. Let's now look at Imam Sadiq's method of resistance. But before that, please give me a salawat.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
So Imam al-Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him, did not merely critique the ruling establishment. He built an alternative. His weapon was not the sword, but the creation of a vast scientific and jurisprudential domain, a school of thought that transmitted the Quran and Sunnah in their authentic form, free from the distortions of power. Through teaching, debating, and issuing rulings contrary to the court jurists, the Imam transformed the act of scholarship into an act of resistance. To gather students around him was to undermine the legitimacy of the state. to issue rulings in line with divine truth was to expose the falsity of government-issued fatwas, declaring the illegitimacy of the rulers. Imam al-Sadiq explicitly contrasted the authority of the al-Bayt with that of the rulers. In Al-Kafi we have, Imam al-Sadiq has said, "We are the people whose obedience God has made obligatory, yet you follow those whose ignorance the people are not excused from." The Quran confirms that followers cannot shift blame onto corrupt leaders. In Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, chapter of the cow, second chapter of the Quran, verse 167, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, "Those who followed will say, if only we had another turn, we would disown them just as they disowned us." And also in Surah Al-Ghafir, the chapter of the forgiver, 40th chapter of the Quran, verse 47, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "As they dispute in the fire, the weak will say to those who are arrogant, indeed, we were your followers. Will you then relieve us of any share of the fire?" Imam al-Sadiq turned these verses into a living warning. To obey rulers devoid of divine knowledge is itself a sin. Let's now look at knowledge and weapon as conditions of leadership. The Imam also inherited and transmitted a profound teaching about leadership. Imam al-Rida, peace and blessings be upon him, narrates from his grandfather, Imam al-Baqir, "Indeed, the weapon among us is like the ark among the children of Israel. Wherever the ark was, prophethood was. Likewise, whoever holds the weapon amongst us, to him belongs the Imamah." When asked whether it was possible that one might hold the weapon without knowledge, the Imam replied, "That cannot be." This teaching shows us, and again, these are all referenced in the write-up. I would recommend everyone take a look. This teaching shows us that true Islamic leadership requires both ilm, knowledge, and quwwah, strength or authority. Neither alone suffices. As Ayatollah Misbah, may God rest his pure soul, comments, Islamic leadership is not realized through knowledge alone, nor through power alone. Rather, it emerges from the union of knowledge and power. Let's now look at jurisprudence as a calm but persistent jihad. By nurturing thousands of students, among them giants such as Hisham ibn al-Hakam, Zurara ibn Ayan, and Mufaddal ibn Umar, Imam al-Sadiq waged a silent jihad. Unlike the military uprisings that were quickly crushed, his scholarly resistance could not be extinguished. The martyr, Sayyid Abbas al-Musawi, may God rest his pure soul, once described Imam al-Sadiq's method as a calm yet profound revolution, proving that the word can shatter the thrones of tyranny just as surely as the sword. So what was the reaction of the state? Let's look at the state's reaction. The Abbasid rulers, unlike their Umayyad predecessors, had spent years in close proximity to the Alawite, to the al-Bayt circles before seizing power. In this context, when I use the term Alawite, I mean those people who were partisans of Ali, of Imam Ali. So the Abbasids knew the Alawites very well. They knew the depth of the Ahl-Bayt's appeal and the potency of their ideological struggle. Therefore, once the Abbasids secured the throne, they were acutely aware of the threat posed by Imam al-Sadiq's school of thought. Let's now look at al-Mansur's anxiety. Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, the second Abbasid Khalif, was particularly wary. He was well known for his cunning and sharp intelligence, and he realized that Imam's network of students and scholars represented a parallel authority that undermined his own legitimacy. The Imam did not need armies or banners. His lessons were enough to delegitimize the Caliphate. Historical sources preserve this hostility. Ibn Shahr al-Shub narrates, Mansur repeatedly tried to restrict the Imam's gatherings. He says, Mansur, forbade the people from sitting with him, with Imam al-Sadiq, or asking questions regarding the lawful and the unlawful. Mufaddal ibn Umar, a close companion of the Imam, reports that even simple issues like questions on marriage and divorce became difficult to ask because spies and restrictions surrounded the Imam. Let's now look at pressure and surveillance. The Imam was repeatedly summoned to Baghdad. He was interrogated and placed under surveillance. Although Mansur did not kill him outright, perhaps fearing the backlash of open martyrdom, he sought to suffocate the Imam's influence. The strategy was twofold. Number one, isolate the Imam by preventing people from attending his lessons. And number two, empower court scholars to drown out his voice with state-sanctioned jurisprudence. Imam Khamenei, may God protect him, draws a parallel between this and modern regimes' fear of independent religious authority. He says, tyrannical and oppressive Taghuti powers fear the word of truth that comes from the mouth of an independent scholar. Sometimes this true word is more dangerous to them than the sword. Let's now look at the logic of suppression. For Mansur, the danger was not theoretical. He had witnessed uprisings like that of Imam Zayd ibn Ali, and he knew that the al-Bayt commanded not only sympathy, but also loyalty. To allow Imam al-Sadiq's school to expand unchecked was to risk creating a spiritual political force that could topple dynasties. The martyr, Ayatollah Sayyid Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr, may Allah rest his pure soul, observed, Imam al-Sadiq possessed a school that was broad and far-reaching within the Ummah, and this constituted a serious challenge to the Abbasid authority. Al-Mansur's restrictions upon him and his prevention of the Imam's dissemination of knowledge were nothing but a practical admission of the danger that this school posed to him. Let's now look at jurisprudence as jihad. Imam Jafar ibn Muhammad al-Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him, lived at a moment when the outward face of Islam was being reshaped by rulers who lacked both the spirit and knowledge of the religion. Their solution was to co-opt scholars, fabricate narrations, and distort divine law through methods like qiyas, analogy, and istihsan, subjective preference. Against this backdrop, Imam al-Sadiq's project of spreading true jurisprudence was not an academic exercise. It was a form of resistance, a jihad without swords, but with words and principles. His establishment of the Jafari school carried two revolutionary dimensions. Firstly, it delegitimized the Caliphate. By exposing the rulers' ignorance and demonstrating that they lacked the qualifications of religious leadership, he stripped away their claim to divine authority. Secondly, by confronting distortions, by rejecting political fatwas and grounding rulings solely in Quran and authentic hadith, he preserved the integrity of Islam against manipulation. The Quran describes precisely this mission in Surah Anfal, the chapter of the spoils of war, 8th chapter of the Quran, verse number 8. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, that he may establish the truth and nullify falsehood, though the guilty might be averse. In this org, though the guilty be averse. In this light, Imam al-Sadiq's jurisprudence was itself a battlefield. His teaching circles were arenas of jihad, and his students were soldiers of truth. The very act of issuing a fatwa in accordance with divine revelation, rather than state policy, was an act of rebellion against tyranny. Imam Khomeini, God rest his pure soul, echoed this when he insisted that fiqh must never be reduced to personal piety detached from politics. He says, fiqh is the true and comprehensive theory for the administration of man and society from the cradle to the grave. The idea that Islam came only to lay out a few devotional matters or to provide prayer and personal remembrance and seclusion is a false notion. Islam is a religion of politics. It is a religion that came to establish government and to administer society. Those who have confined fiqh to the personal and private corners of life have not understood Islam. Fiqh is a system of life. It is a law that takes into account all dimensions of human existence, from acts of worship to transactions, social matters, and politics. Fiqh is the weapon of the nation against oppression and tyranny. It is the guide for liberating man from the servitude of the Taghut and for attaining freedom and justice. Said Hassan Nasrallah, may God rest his pure soul, reinforced the same principle in the context of modern resistance. He said, when we adhere to the school of al-Bayt, peace and blessings be upon them, we do not see in it only the rulings of purity or impurity, prayer and fasting. Rather, we see in it a project of life, a project of resistance, a project of liberation from oppression and arrogance. Therefore, Imam al-Sadiq bequeathed to the Shia not only a methodology of jurisprudence, but a method of resistance, a jurisprudence of integrity, clarity, and confrontation with distortion. His calm yet unyielding jihad of teaching is what preserved Islam's authenticity when power sought to corrupt it. This is the essence of Jihad al-Tabyeen: to clarify, to unveil, to resist, even when the battlefield is the classroom and the weapon is the word. Please give me a loud salawat, and we now look at the existence of hidden and concealed politico-ideological organizations.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
So now let's look at the formation of a network of believers. Through the tireless efforts of his forefathers, particularly Imam Sajjad and Imam al-Baqir, Imam Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon them all, was able to cultivate a remarkable network of believers spread across the Islamic world. By the later years of Imam al-Baqir's life, this cadre had already begun to take shape. Men and women who were learned, devoted, revolutionary in spirit, willing to sacrifice, and unafraid of risk. They did not belong to a superior caste. Rather, they came from diverse walks of life: tradesmen, artisans, merchants, and servants. Yet in their intellectual and spiritual caliber, they were far from a rabble. Their lives revolved entirely around a higher purpose: the protection of Islam through loyalty to the Imamah. The Quran itself points to such hidden circles of believers who carry divine trust amidst hostile societies. In Quran, Surah Al-A'raf, the chapter of the heights, 7th chapter of the Quran, verse 159, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Among the people of Moses is a community who guide others by the truth and thereby act justly." This Quranic description mirrors the Shia movements at the time of Imam al-Sadiq: small yet firm, oppressed yet purposeful. And their presence was not limited to Medina. Indeed, they were stronger in Kufa, with pockets even in Syria and Khorasan. This was no loose affiliation, but rather a network, which could be described as the Tashayyu' Party, an underground organization that ensured the continuity of Wilayah across the vast Islamic world. Let's look at the activities of the hidden organization. This network engaged in significant activities across Iraq, Khorasan, and beyond. At its heart lay the defense and propagation of the doctrine of Imamah, yet its work was multifaceted: education, mobilization, and the preservation of Quranic Islam amidst the Abbasid and Umayyad attempts to distort it. Imam al-Sadiq nurtured companions like Zurara ibn Ayyan, Hisham ibn al-Malik, Hisham ibn al-Hakam, and Jabir ibn Yazid al-Juhfi, who we've mentioned before, who not only mastered theology and jurisprudence, but also operated as nodes in this hidden movement. The Imam himself declared, "May God have mercy on Zurara ibn Ayyan. If it were not for him and his companions, the traditions of my father would have perished." This testimony that without these carefully nurtured individuals, the knowledge and political vision of the Imams would have been erased. Let's now look at the necessity of concealment. The clandestine nature of this organization was itself a form of Taqiyyah. The Quran acknowledges that in times of existential threat, believers may conceal their faith while working for its preservation. In Quran, Surah Al-Imran, the chapter of the family of Imran, 3rd chapter of the Quran, verse 28, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Except when you protect yourselves from them out of precaution." Thus, no direct documentation or confession of these underground structures could ever be expected. Even if confronted by enemies, the Imam and his companions would deny such claims, branding them as baseless suspicion, because this was the very essence of clandestine struggle. Imam Khamenei, describing the Imam struggle, explains, the political activity of the Imams, peace and blessings be upon them, was carried out within a framework that was both secret and organized. So let's now look at reading the hidden signs. For this reason, historians cannot rely upon overt evidence. Instead, they must observe patterns, correlations, and the silent fingerprints of resistance. What seems like an isolated theological debate, a journey of a companion, or a sudden uprising in a distant land, may in fact be part of this hidden web of organization. Imam al-Sadiq himself hinted at this when he said, "This matter of ours, the Imamah, is veiled and protected by covenant. Whoever God guides to it accepts it, and whoever God blinds from it denies it." It was not only doctrine that was veiled, it was the entire revolutionary framework. Let's now look at its continuity across the centuries. Now, when we consider the 2.5 centuries of the Imam's leadership, of all of the Imams collectively, as we've said, the 250-year-old man, the existence of such a hidden organization becomes an undeniable reality. They ensured survival through concealment until the time when conditions permitted open confrontation, as with Imam Hussein on the plains of Karbala, or later through the uprisings inspired by the Imam's legacy. Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, reflecting on this continuity of hidden struggle, remarked, "The school of the Imams, peace and blessings be upon them, is a complete school. Some of the Imams were in a position of patience, endurance, and secret work, while others were in a position of open confrontation and great sacrifices, such as Imam Hussein, peace be upon him. We learned from the school of the Imams that there is a time for secret action and a time for open confrontation. The Imams practiced both approaches, and in the resistance, we draw inspiration from this in our path and our Jihad." This is precisely the legacy of Imam al-Sadiq, a hidden yet far-reaching politico-ideological organization that preserved the Imamah, ensured the survival of Quranic Islam, and laid the groundwork for future resistance. Please give me a salawat, and we'll now look at the idea of clarifying the meaning of organization.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرج.
So when we speak of organization in the context of the Imams, it is vital not to impose upon it the modern imagery of political parties, with their constitutions and their offices and their ranks and their public gatherings and so on. The reality of the Shia organization in the early centuries of Islam was far more subtle and concealed. It was not a party in the contemporary sense, but rather a living body of believers bound together by a single heart, the Imam. It was, in essence, a community of men and women who shared a common conviction and goal: to recognize the rightful authority of the divinely appointed Imam and to carry out their duties in relation to him. Around this center, the Imam as the palpitating heart and commanding brain, they formed intimate bonds, networks of loyalty, and a spiritual fraternity that enabled them to act with discipline, even in the most suffocating conditions of repression. This notion is reflected in the Quran itself. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, God says in Surah Al-Ma'idah, the chapter of the table spread, 5th chapter of the Quran, verse number 56, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Whoever takes God, his apostle, and those who have faith as their guardian, indeed it is the party of God that will be victorious." Here the Quran speaks of a hizb, a party or organization, that is not outwardly registered, but is inwardly united. It is the Hizb Allah, the party of God, whose coherence lies in loyalty to the divinely designated leaders. By contrast, the Quran also speaks of Hizb al-Shaytan, the party of Satan, which is a fractured, self-serving, and is destined for loss. In Surah Al-Mujadala, the chapter of the disputant, 58th chapter of the Quran, verse number 19, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Satan has prevailed upon them, so he has caused them to forget the remembrance of God. They are the party of Satan. Look, indeed, it is the party of Satan who are the losers." Imam Ali, peace and blessings be upon him, alluded to the same truth when he said, Know that the people must have a leader, righteous or wicked. This statement highlights that human beings inevitably organize themselves around a leadership, whether legitimate or illegitimate. The question is whether the organization is one of truth, rooted in Wilayah, or one of falsehood, rooted in tyranny. In this light, the secret Shia organization under the Imams was not a man-made invention. Rather, it was a divine necessity, a vessel through which the truth of Imamah could be preserved in hostile times. Imam Khomeini, may God rest his pure soul, reflecting on this, stated, the survival of Shiism throughout the centuries has been due to this very concealed organization and hidden structuring. Imam Khamenei too has emphasized that even when the Shia were very few and scattered, their strength came from their inner order and discipline, bound by allegiance to the Imam. He says, Shiism advanced from its very beginning with organization and cohesion at the heart of Taqiyyah. Therefore, organization in the Shia sense meant an organic network tied to the Imam, operating quietly but firmly, preserved by Taqiyyah, yet never losing its sense of direction. It was a seedbed for endurance, growth, and eventual revolution. Let's now look at the roots of the Shia organization in the time of Imam Ali. But please give me a salawat before that.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم.
So, the foundations of the Shia organization were laid in the lifetime of Imam Ali, peace and blessings be upon him, particularly in the turbulent 25 years between the event of Saqifa and his eventual Caliphate. During this period, when the divine right of the Imam was set aside by political maneuvering, a small band of loyal companions formed the nucleus of a concealed organization that preserved the truth of Wilayah. These companions were not ordinary followers. They were men of insight and unwavering devotion, people like Salman al-Muhammadi or Salman al-Farisi, Abu Dhar Ghafari, Miqdad ibn al-Aswad, Ammar ibn Yasir, Uday ibn Ka'ab, Hudayfa al-Yamani, and others. They recognized that legitimate authority lay solely with Imam Ali, with Ali ibn Abi Talib, designated by the Prophet at Ghadir Qom, when Prophet Muhammad said, whoever I am his master, this Ali is his master. When the Imam outwardly exercised patience, even cooperating at times for the preservation of Islam, these companions inwardly maintained allegiance to him and transmitted his virtues among the people. Their efforts ensured that the memory of Ghadir and the principle of divine leadership did not disappear from the Ummah's conscience. This was not an accidental grouping, but it was a purposeful network held together by conviction. They became known as the Shi'at Ali, or the party of Ali. Imam al-Sadiq would later confirm, they were named the Shia only because they were the Shia of Ali. And the Quran itself bears witness to the existence of such partisanship for the cause of truth. Regarding Prophet Ibrahim, God says, this is Surah Safat, the chapter of the Ranges, 37th chapter of the Quran, verse 83. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, indeed amongst his Shia was Ibrahim. This establishes that Shia is not a later political label, but rather it is a Quranic category. Those who recognize the divinely chosen leader and align themselves with him in devotion and struggle. Imam Ali himself acknowledged this and nurtured this hidden fraternity. In Nahj Balagha, he distinguishes between those who faltered under pressure and those who remained steadfast. He says in Sermon 97, they recognized the truth and bound themselves to it, and they perceived falsehood and kept away from it. These men and women, by their insight or basira and endurance, formed the earliest cells of what we may call the Shia organization. Outwardly, they lived as ordinary members of the Muslim community, but inwardly, they carried the Imam's vision, quietly preparing the grounds for the day when divine authority would once again be manifest. Contemporary scholars have underlined this reality. Ayatollah Sayyid Muhammad Hussein Fadlallah, may God rest his pure soul, says, he actually wrote, Shiism did not begin as an emotional movement, but as a conscious organization bound to the rightful Imam in the path of creed and leadership. Therefore, the very first Shia organization was not an invention of later centuries. It was a living reality from the earliest days of Islam, forged in the crucible of Saqifa, tempered by the patience of Imam Ali, and sustained by the loyalty of his elect companions. Let's now look at its continuation under Imam al-Hassan. When Imam Hassan, peace and blessings be upon him, assumed leadership after the martyrdom of his father Imam Ali, the conditions were extraordinarily difficult. Muawiyah's regime wielded both political cunning and brutal force. Public cursing of Imam Ali was institutionalized from pulpits across the Muslim world, while surveillance and repression stifled any open opposition. It was in this climate that the Imam signed the peace treaty with Muawiyah. Though outwardly appearing as a retreat, in reality this treaty was a strategic move to safeguard the core of the Shia community and to allow the concealed organization to regroup and to expand. Imam Hassan transformed apparent silence into a new phase of planning, of discipline, and of underground resistance. Let's now look at the proposal given by Musayyib and Sulaiman. Historical sources record that after the treaty, a group of devoted Shia led by Musayyib ibn Najabat and Sulaiman ibn Surad al-Khuzai came to the Imam with a proposal. They wished to gather military forces, seize Kufa, and confront the Syrian army. Of course, the Umayyads were in Syria. Out of loyalty, they placed their lives at the Imam's disposal. Yet, Imam Hassan refused. He drew them into private council, explained matters in a way that history has not fully preserved, and convinced them of the futility of a premature uprising. Instead, he ordered them to return to their communities, live amongst the people, and await the appropriate moment. This was not passivity, rather it was foresight. By restraining an ill-prepared rebellion, the Imam ensured that the Shia movement could survive long enough to outlast Muawiyah's tyranny and to sow the seeds for future revolts. Let's now look at Imam Ali's testament in Tuhaf al-Uqul. The Imam's strategy, and Imam Hassan's strategy, was in full alignment with the will of his father, Imam Ali, peace and blessings be upon him, who had prophesied the trials to come. He says, Imam Ali says, when you lose me, you will see after me events such that one of you will wish for death. You will see injustice, oppression, monopolization, and the belittling of God's right, and fear will grip your lives. When that occurs, bind yourselves together through the rope of God and do not scatter. Hold fast to patience, prayer, and Taqiyyah, and know that God detests discord amongst his servants. Do not abandon the truth and its people, for whoever chooses another in place of us loses both this world and the next. This will encapsulates the core pillars of the concealed organization: unity, patience, prayer, and Taqiyyah. Imam Hassan's rejection of reckless militarism and his insistence on organized endurance were direct applications of this guidance. Let's now have a look at strength in concealment. So paradoxically, the suffocating repression of the Umayyads only served to strengthen Shia cohesion. What might have been a moment of despair became instead a catalyst for greater discipline and tighter bonds. As Imam Khamenei observed, the pressure and suffocation imposed by the enemy only led the Shia to greater cohesion and solidity. Therefore, during Imam Hassan's era, the Shia movement transitioned from public resistance into carefully concealed organization. It was not an abandonment of struggle, but a reconfiguration of struggle, one that preserved the Imam's followers through the darkest period of Umayyad tyranny, preparing them for the uprising of Imam Hussein and the future revolts that would follow Karbala. Let's now look at the developments under Imam al-Hussein. The concealed organization, carefully preserved during the years of Imam Hassan's leadership, began to reveal its strength during the time of Imam Hussein, peace and blessings be upon him. Muawiyah's death after 2 decades of iron-fisted rule created a political vacuum. Yazid's illegitimate claim to succession exposed the true face of Umayyad corruption, and Shia networks across Kufa, Hijaz, and beyond sprang into action. Firstly, you have the letters from Kufa. Thousands of letters poured in from Iraq to Imam Hussein, urging him to rise and promising allegiance. This mass correspondence was not the spontaneous gesture of a disorganized populace. It was the fruit of 20 years of underground preparation. The Shia leaders in Kufa, men like Sulaiman ibn Surad al-Khuzai, Habib ibn Madahir, and others, were the inheritors of the hidden cells that Imam Hassan had protected. These letters were evidence of an already functioning organization, capable of mobilizing, coordinating, and conveying collective will across regions. Historians have noted that the Umayyad governor of Medina, alarmed by such reports, wrote to Muawiyah warning, "Some of the people of Iraq and notable men of Hijaz are in contact with Hussein. It seems he intends to rise in opposition. I have investigated and found that he plans to raise the banner of revolt." And then, of course, you have the uprising of Karbala. Imam Hussein's martyrdom in Karbala in 61 AH was the most decisive moment in Shia history. Outwardly, the Imam stood with only a few dozen companions against an entire empire. Yet inwardly, he embodied the culmination of the hidden organization's mission to bear witness against tyranny and preserve the divine legitimacy of Imamah. The Quran describes the role of such witnesses in Surah Anfal, the chapter of the spoils of war, 8th chapter of the Quran, verse number 42. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "So that he who perishes may perish by a clear proof, and he who lives may live by a clear proof." Karbala was the bayyinah, the clear proof. It divided the ummah and ensured that no Muslim could thereafter claim ignorance of Yazid's corruption. Let's now look at the Tawaabeen, the penitents, and Mukhtar. So in the aftermath, the psychological impact on the Shia community was profound. The very people of Kufa who had failed to support Imam Hussein were consumed by regret. Their remorse gave birth to the Tawaabeen, the penitents, a movement that armed itself to atone for abandoning the Imam. Later, Mukhtar al-Thaqafi led a much more organized uprising, bringing together thousands under the banner of vengeance for Imam Hussein. He and his commanders, such as Ibrahim ibn Malik al-Ashtar, the son of the famous Malik Ashtar, executed many of the perpetrators of Karbala. The historian al-Tabari, who is a Sunni historian, records, "The Shia were continually collecting weapons, training militias, and secretly inviting people, whether Shia or not, to rise for the revenge of Hussein. Thus, group after group joined them until the death of Yazid ibn Muawiyah." Let's now look at from remorse to organized resistance. Scholars such as Sheikh Ziyarah Aal-e-Yaseen and modern historians like Hussein Mudarrisi, Wilfred Medling, and Rasul Jafariyan agree that the Tawaabeen and Mukhtar's revolt were not accidental spasms of grief. They were the natural evolution of a concealed but coherent Shia organization, which had been carefully nurtured from the time of Imam Ali through Imam Hassan. As the author of Jihad al-Shia, Sheikh Muhammad Rida al-Muzaffar, observes, the Shia community after Imam Hussein's martyrdom appeared like a well-formed organization, whose political links and religious beliefs gave them coherence with leadership, gatherings, and fighting forces. The Tawaabeen were the first clear manifestation of this. Now we look at the Imam's enduring organization. Therefore, far from being extinguished at Karbala, the hidden organization entered a new phase, one fueled by martyrdom and remorse. animated by a thirst for justice and increasingly visible in the political fabric of the Muslim world. Imam Hussein had sacrificed his life not only to preserve the truth of Islam, but to ensure that the Shia, as a body of the faithful bound to the Imam, would survive and grow as an organized movement of resistance against tyranny. Now we look at the consolidation of the hidden organization under Imam al-Sajjad, Imam al-Baqir, and then Imam al-Sadiq. So after the catastrophe of Karbala, the Shia movement entered a long and painful period of mourning, remorse, and repression. Yet it was precisely in this crucible that the hidden organization took on a more defined and lasting form. Firstly, we look at Imam Sajjad and resistance in chains. Imam Zayn al-Abidin, peace and blessings be upon him, the lone surviving adult male of Karbala, bore the dual responsibility of preserving the message and reorganizing the Shia community. His role was not in open rebellion, but in spiritual and intellectual resistance. His Sahifa Sajjadiyya, Risalat al-Huquq, and whispered prayers became coded sermons, educating his followers under the cover of devotion. He reminded them, and this is a very important quote, he reminded them that the true Shia were few in number, not merely those who sympathized emotionally with al-Bayt, but those willing to live and die under the Imam's guidance. Imam al-Sadiq later recalled, in the time of Ali ibn al-Hussein, there were only 5 true Shia. This limitation was not numerical, rather it was qualitative. It pointed to a disciplined inner circle, the backbone of the organization, through whom the Imam's mission could survive in hostile terrain. Now we look at Imam al-Baqir spreading knowledge as organization. With the Umayyads weakened by internal strife, Imam al-Baqir expanded the scope of the Shia organization by openly teaching in Medina. His gatherings were not only centers of jurisprudence and Quranic exegesis, but also hubs of political orientation, producing scholars and preachers who disseminated the doctrine of Imamah across the Muslim world. The Quran describes the dual mission of such an organized body in Surah As-Sajdah, the chapter of the prostration, 32nd chapter of the Quran, verse 24, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "We appointed among them leaders who guided by our command, so long as they were patient and had certainty in our signs." Patience, or sabr, and certainty, yaqeen, were defining features of this hidden organization. Endurance under persecution, and clarity in guidance. Now we come to Imam al-Sadiq, the culmination of the hidden network. Imam al-Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him, inherited and perfected this underground structure. His era coincided with the weakening of the Umayyads and the rise of the Abbasids, creating a rare opening. He established the most extensive network of students and missionaries in Shia history up to that point, numbering in the thousands. Yet even here, the organization was dual-layered. Outwardly a scholarly school, inwardly a politico-ideological network committed to the survival of the Imamah. The Imam taught his followers the principles of Taqiyyah as a shield for the organization. He said, "Taqiyyah is my religion and the religion of my forefathers. There is no faith for the one who has no Taqiyyah." Far from cowardice, Taqiyyah was a strategy of survival, enabling the Shia organization to thrive under the watchful eyes of tyrants without exposing itself to annihilation. And the defining feature, that was Wilayah. At this stage, it became clear that the name Shia was not to be applied loosely to anyone who expressed love for the Prophet's household. The true Shia were those who combined love with loyalty, knowledge with action, and faith with organization. They were those who stood under the banner of Wilayah. Imam Ali had described them centuries earlier. He said in Nahj al-Balagha, and again, all the references are in the write-up, "They are those who bound themselves to the truth and followed it, and who recognized falsehood and avoided it. This was the essence of the hidden organization, an inner circle that lived for the Imam's mission, expanded cautiously, and prepared the grounds for the day when divine governance could once again be openly proclaimed. Imam Khomeini, reflecting on this long arc of concealment, observed, "The survival of the school of Shiism throughout history has been indebted to the precise organization and intelligent taqiyyah of the Imams." Said Hassan Nasrallah, may God rest his pure soul, similarly remarked, "The secret of the survival of this path lies in its commitment to organization, discipline, and wilayah." Therefore, by the time of Imam al-Sadiq, the concealed organization had matured into a resilient network that spanned cities and regions. It nurtured scholars and preachers and stood as a quiet yet formidable challenge to the ruling dynasties. It was not a political party in the worldly sense, but a divine movement whose soul was wilayah, whose shield was taqiyyah, and whose strength was endurance in truth. Please give me a loud salawat and we move on to the conclusion.
اللهم صل على محمد وعلى
محمد وعجل فرجه.
So now the Shia as the hidden party of God. From Imam Ali to Imam Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon them all, we see a continuous pattern. The Shia were never merely a collection of sympathizers or a sentimental community. They were, in their truest sense, an organized body, consciously bound to the Imam through love, loyalty, knowledge, and action. This concealed organization was not incidental, but it was divinely willed. The Quran declares in Surah Al-Ma'idah, the chapter of the table spread, 5th chapter of the Quran, verse 56, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, "Whoever takes God, his apostle, and those who have faith as their guardian, indeed it is the party of God that will be victorious." Here lies the defining truth. The Shia were the Hizbullah, the party of God, standing in stark contrast to the Hizb al-Shaytan, the party of tyranny and deception. Their survival was not due to numbers or political dominance, but due to inner cohesion, spiritual discipline, and taqiyyah as a protective shield. Let's now look at the inner circle of true Shia. Imam al-Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him, famously said that the true Shia in his father's time were no more than a handful. This limitation was not meant to belittle the wider community, but to remind us that quality outweighed quantity. That quality outweighed quantity. A true Shia was not defined by verbal allegiance alone, but by wilayah, intellectual and practical alignment with the Imam's mission. This is why early historians, from al-Tabari to al-Mudaffar, the author of Jihad al-Shia, recognized that after Karbala, the Shia emerged not as scattered mourners, but as a cohesive organization, capable of training, planning, and launching movements like the Tawaabin and Mukhtar's revolt. Organized resistance as a divine sunnah. This dual reality, concealment yet resilience, and patience yet preparation, has been the hallmark of Shiism across centuries. Imam Khomeini, may God rest his pure soul, observed, "The survival of the school of Shiism throughout history has been indebted to the precise organization and intelligent taqiyyah of the Imams." And Imam Khamenei has often repeated that clarity and organization are the only way to withstand sedition and propaganda in every age. He says, or he's quoted as saying, "Truth cannot endure without organized clarification and collective steadfastness." So now we look at the bridge to our age. So what we learn from this long arc of history is that the Shia organization is not a relic of the past, but it is a living model. Its essence is timeless: loyalty to the Imam of the age, concealment when necessary, endurance and hardship, and preparation for the moment when divine governance may once again rise openly. This is why contemporary movements of resistance from Lebanon to Iraq and beyond identify themselves as Hizbullah, the Party of God, inheritors of the same concealed yet victorious organization forged by Imam Ali, Imam Hassan, Imam Hussein, Imam Sajjad, Imam Baqir, and perfected in the era of Imam al-Sadiq. Let us now look at going towards the awaited Imam. Ultimately, this organization is not an end in itself, but a preparation for the return of Imam al-Hujjah. May our souls be his ransom, and may God hasten his return. The Shia throughout history have lived with the conviction that every hidden circle, every underground bond of loyalty, every whispered prayer and concealed act of defiance is part of the great chain that leads to the Imam of the age. Until that day, the command remains, as Imam Ali said, patience, prayer, unity, and Taqiyyah. These are not signs of weakness, but of divine wisdom, the very foundations of the organization that preserved Islam and continues to inspire the struggle for justice today. Please give me a salawat, and we move to the supplication eulogy for the keeper of the hidden organization.
اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد.
In the name of God, the concealer of secrets and the revealer of victories. O God, send your blessings upon Muhammad and the family of Muhammad, the lanterns of your guidance, the bearers of your trust, the guardians of your concealed cause. O my master, Jafar ibn Muhammad al-Sadiq, peace be upon you, O son of the truthful line. Peace be upon you, O heir of the prayers of Sajjad, the knowledge of Baqir, and the martyrdom of Hussein. You built a nation in whispers and planted an army in chains. You spread knowledge like fire in the night, but concealed it beneath the veil of Taqiyyah. Your words reached thousands, yet only a handful knew the full weight of your secret. You were the Imam of the hidden organization, the commander of a party without banners, and the shepherd of hearts that lived by Wilayah. O God, we bear witness that Imam al-Sadiq did not abandon your command, that he preserved the covenant of Ali, that he guarded the light of Hussein, that he prepared the way for the Qa'im, the one who will rise with your final justice. O Lord of the age, make us among the true Shia, those few who bind themselves to their Imam, those who do not falter in hardship, those who hide when concealment is commanded, and rise when rising is decreed. O awaited Master, O Mahdi, we call out to you with the words of Ziyarah Aal-e-Yaseen. Peace be upon you, O caller to God and interpreter of his signs. O son of Hussein, O inheritor of Sadiq, we await you as the culmination of every hidden gathering, every whispered prayer, every concealed tear. Hasten, O Lord, his appearance. Gather us beneath his banner. Do not test us with absence, but honor us with presence. And let us be counted, not among those who only claim to love, but among those who lived and died in the hidden organization of Wilayah, until the earth is filled with justice as it was filled with oppression. O God, by the truth of Muhammad and his pure progeny, make us worthy of that day, and grant us the honor of praying behind the Mahdi, with Jesus, the son of Mary, beneath the banner of Hussein, in Mecca, in Medina, and in al-Quds. O God, hasten the return of your representative, the Imam, and make us amongst his supporters, his helpers, and those martyred at his command. Amen, O Lord of the worlds. Amen, O most merciful of the merciful. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.